give it to them for the next talk.
Awesome. Good day. Yeah, so Robin and I are the field CTOs in EMEA. We'll introduce ourselves separately. There's a bunch of stuff up there about sort of what we've done in our careers. But what's not there is I come from a deeply academic background. I was a protein biochemist. I studied cellular biology and I studied the interactions of proteins at like ridiculous levels. I used to use machine learning and AI to do this before cloud, before majority of the really interesting things, even before Hadoop. So I know how complicated these hard problems are. I've also worked in industry in a kind of parallel track. So what I find super fascinating is how the sort of organisms that you get to study, you can kind of translate that to organizations and how they operate. So a lot of this is about that.
And unlike my academic achievement coworker here, I come from the dirt of Korea. I started my career as a U.S. Army soldier repairing Apache helicopters on the Korean DMZ. So my education was life and trying to figure that out. I remember when Office was released, I was the one person who could figure out how to actually use Excel to track parts for the Apache helicopter. So that was my entry into data and data analytics. But similar to Dael, I spent many, many years at Microsoft across the engineering teams and operational roles, and finally landing as Chief Data Officer of Microsoft UK, where I spent much of my career focused around people and process. How do you build on great technologies that you've already built? And so what Dael and I are going to cover with you today is a little bit about that real world. How in your organization do you think about leveraging some of our lessons learned and not make some of those same mistakes? So I know Ali shared this at the big keynote, and we had to submit these slides so far in advance. I didn't get the 10,000 number, but a little bit of where we come from is Dael and I are in a very unique role. So as the field CTOs, there are 4 of us globally for Databricks that cover the entire world. So there's 2 based out of the US, and then the 2 of us are based out of London. And we get to talk to hundreds of customers. Feels like hundreds a week, but it's probably really closer to 40 or 50 customers a week, to the C-level executives across these customers about how are they thinking about how Databricks is going to empower their data strategies, their data objectives, the business goals and organizational objectives that they're trying to accomplish. And so much of what we're going to share with you is not just our lived experience, but also what we've learned from all of these customers across the market that we get to work with every day.
So just a quick background, because a lot of people don't sort of know this about Databricks. Everyone knows the UC Berkeley story, but a lot of people don't know that Spark was the original footnote in the Apache Mesos paper, which means that Spark was an ML first use case. That was the absolute first use case. The second use case in that Apache Mesos paper was Hadoop. So what's super fascinating in that is the story arc that our technology and our platform has gone through and how that plays into both academia and also into open source and these open source communities that you heard so much about. What's different is we actually have teams dedicated to fostering the growth of these communities. So, in the early days, and our founders will speak about this, like they used to rent like an enterprise, rent a car, and they would drive around and try to create Spark communities. And that was ultimately the first sort of origin story. We get the benefit of like attending these really cool fireside chats with them. So we hear these really cool stories, and it's just this incredible momentum that's happened. And Databricks has kind of done these super interesting things, but every time there's this donation out to open source. With Delta, that went into Linux for a very good reason. It went in because we saw it being much bigger and far more, necessary of governance. Like the Linux Foundation has a very hardened governance principle as opposed to the Apache Foundation. And that means that there's a lot more rigor that goes around it, but it could also deal with the scale that we expected from the Delta community. MLflow was no different. And we're starting to really, this summit's been, you know, a lot of people don't realize it's been actually an ML flow story. There's a massive ML flow story. So we kind of donated ML flow back in 2018, and what we're starting to see is how that pays off. Delta's been kind of through a couple of versions, and then we're starting to sort of see this arc around, you know, compute really changing the nature. So that kind of icon in the top corner is Photon, and it's really an evolution to Spark. It's an incredible processing engine. And right now, you know, Dolly being the symbol of open source language models, small, like incredibly powerful, and that's just getting going. And Dolly's literally just the first one. Hugging Face has tons of them. And that's a really interesting sort of counter story that's happening in the generative AI space. So we've almost got the spectrum starting to form in this basis. But this is our story, and we know that this is a 10-year story. And Databricks wants to figure out what does that 20-year story look like. And with customers, we want to educate you into some of the crazy stuff that we see when we chat to you, some of the things we've experienced during our careers, and some of the things that we're helping, even internally, for Databricks to like grow to that iconic brand that we think we have the potential to do.
So it wouldn't be a summit talk if we didn't ground in generative AI. Yes, I think every session, if you did not hear Gen AI, then you were probably in the wrong room and not at anything having to do with Data and AI Summit. What we did was there's an MIT study that was conducted in September of 2022 that essentially more than 78% of CIOs said that they did view AI as being critical to their future strategy by 2025. I would say if we had to gauge it by the conversations that we've had since then, this is probably closer to 95 to 198, 99. It's probably the one CEO sitting somewhere who's not thinking about it. Everybody else is thinking
I met him. He literally is going, I don't believe this stuff.
It's not real. So
snake oil.
So it's been super interesting just to see, I think, the volume and speed at which executives are now putting pressure on the ecosystem to think about generative AI, and how you're all, I'm sure, feeling the pressure of your executives and teams having to deliver against this sort of vision that they want to. And so that's really what our focus is going to be around this conversation, is what about the rise of generative AI? So when we talk to executives today, there's a couple of questions that they all ask us. The first is this hype real? Is this like an AI, generative AI, an iPhone moment? Like, is it really gonna transform the way that people live their lives and do things in sort of this commonality? Or is it just a passing phase of technology that I don't need to really worry about? Is it a threat or an opportunity, right? So how are we really thinking about the capabilities that this represents? I think all of us saw the example of Samsung putting IP out into ChatGPT, losing trade secrets. Like, the examples continue to come at us where organizations are really seeing the impact of the threat that it represents to your capability to continue to do business. And so how are organizations thinking about the ethical limitations that they need to put around that to allow for innovation while minimizing the risk that they expose themselves to? How lots of organizations are thinking about, how do I use generative AI to gain a competitive advantage? They're thinking that if I'm not doing it, my competition is, and am I going to be outpaced if we're not thinking about how Gen AI integrates into our overall data strategy? And then last but not least, I love these conversations, but how do I protect my IP? By education, I'm an IP attorney, and so I get drawn into a lot of conversations about, we're using generative AI to help us drive code into our IP products, and so how is that going to extend our intellectual property protection around the things that we're leveraging generative AI to create for our organization? And legislation hasn't told us how to interpret that yet, so that's always a fun point.
All right. So we feel that humans are messy. We're also incredibly innovative, and there's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of fear mongering. So I want to take you through a bit of a story arc. Okay? Humans have been at war with each other since the dawn of time, but we found a way to trade, and we found a way to remove friction, okay? And that's an incredibly important story arc, and I'll come back to how we are seeing that play out in the modern world. But if you think about it, you know, in the birth of the sort of free market economics, like, people had to figure out how to go, how am I exchanging X for Y? What is the barter system? That's how it started, and it moved into more of a sort of currency because, you know, people started arguing about, you know, is my cabbage worth your X? And that exchange has actually become commonplace in the world today. We are seeing it sort of play out, and actually, I mean, there was a crazy another hype cycle that happened last year that really was kind of a dovetail on this one, but there are massive implications to how this helps to solve discrepancies between civilized societies and to actually move civilizations forward. If we then move a little bit further forward in life, okay, the printing press was a huge moment. You know, I had the luxury of having grown up on a farm in Zimbabwe where I legitimately had Bushman paintings. That was almost one of the first forms of knowledge sharing. And when the printing press came along, guess what? I think people were as fearful then as they are today. Everybody thought, oh my, these things are taking my job. Well, guess what? We found new jobs, right? Okay, so, and this is an important step because actually we don't do this very well. Like, I'm a parent and, you know, sometimes my kid's having a tantrum over there and like, I'll be like, okay, pick up the parenting book. It's not very helpful to try trawl through, find the index, go find the page and like figure out this particular problem. So I think we're in a position now where actually we can modernize the entire way we do those things. Moving a little more forward in time, do you know that the way we work today has a basis on this legacy that goes all the way back to Napoleon? So Napoleon identified a problem. He needed 400 boots a day, and in order to get 400 boots a day, he needed 400 boot makers to create one set of boots each a day, because that was how things worked back then. Then came along a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor who created something called scientific management. Scientific management was this separate and create production line. So you had analysts, and then you had this production line of little things that were done, and that scaled the production of shoes or boots, right? Fast forward, that was modernized by Toyota, then it was Peter Drucker had a go at it, Andy Grove had a go at it, Agile had a go at it. We all work this way still today. The artifacts of the Industrial Revolution still are commonplace in our ways of working, how our organizations actually function. And that's a really interesting thing because we talk a lot about legacy in the tech space, but the biggest legacy and the oldest legacy that we have to deal with is the organization itself. That operating system is 200 or 300 years old. I'm just going to leave that hanging. Okay, so now we have this massive moment in time. You heard Mark Andreessen this morning, and that was an incredible talk. So if you didn't hear it, go back and listen to it. Read the thesis that he wrote there. But this idea that AI represents massive promise. And let's face it, you know, we are slouching our way to utopia because every time one of these watershed moments happen, and actually 70 years ago, in the 1970s, something kind of similar happened with robotics and blue-collar work. All we're experiencing is the next change. And we actually have history to look back on to help us through that. We've all done this before. We've all been through this before. It's not us, it's our ancestors. So this is how there is an incredible opportunity to shake up a little bit more than just the technology. And that's sort of where we want to go with this conversation today.
But we know that if we aren't careful as we think about this evolution of this next point in time where we're creating something new, we know that it's going to be fraught with danger. And so the approach that Dael and I have taken for this talk for you today is it's the present day Game of Thrones. How are you going to navigate this? People are hard to change. They're set in their ways. There's a lot of fear and irrational inertia in continuing to do things the way that they've done in the past. And people hide. I think if we all looked at our diaries today, how many calendar invites do you have in there where you really need to be focused in that meeting? Why do they really need 200 people to make a decision in a meeting? And so, but people are used to what they're used to, and they'll continue to operate in that way. And so how can we think about the opportunity for AI to really unlock and uncover? The problem with the Game of Thrones is that everyone dies, right? Or you lose your position. So it's a matter of how do you think about being careful as we're implementing these changes across your organization in a way that allows you to take the organization on the journey with you.
But there's something kind of interesting as a counter-argument to this. If anyone models out game theory, and we're all analysts, we all want to look at ways of kind of really analyzing situations like that. If you think about Party A, Party B, and Customer C, the only way everyone wins is collaboration. If you model that out, that is the only way. Somebody will lose or lose their position. And I believe totally that the number of brands in 5 years' time, these will be much smaller blocks, and they are going to be iconic brands that are now in cemeteries because of what is happening today. I fundamentally believe that that is where this is going.
And so that's really what we want to talk about today. Are you playing a Game of Thrones when you think about generative AI in your organization? Or are you going to think about how you're going to let generative AI help you lead a revolution for your organization? So we all know that we talk about people, process, and strategy. So we'll let Dael kick us off with sort of the strategy.
Right, so sometimes Robin and I joke about the CTO title, like what the T actually represents, because really half the time we're translating and half the time we're doing therapy. So we're going to give you a little bit of technology hardly comes up nowadays. Actually, yeah, sort of product features, functions, but like definitely therapy. So strategy is often a commonplace area, and the last 6 months has been a really fascinating sort of time for us. I have never been in more boardrooms. I've never spoke to more CEOs, and legitimately, they want to talk about how this impacts their strategy. How do I leverage this stuff? How do I do it safely? How do I actually build these muscles in my business? I need this capability. This is amazing stuff. This can transform our organization. And I hate using the word transform. That's the CT thing, but it is true. This is a transformative moment, right? So we have these conversations, and we sort of are trying to figure out what's the way we can advise where you can do all of these things, but also start to move forward. So interestingly enough, there's a piece of research that was done by Goldman Sachs. They fundamentally believe that, I mean, think about it. We're not very productive. We're very busy. But can you actually measure the output of your workplace? Like, my wife and I have this joke where people kind of come into the office, they move papers from one side of the desk to the other, and then go and have coffee. And that is a very big commonplace. And I'm not saying that of the technologists. We furiously are trying to get stuff done, maybe. But there are a lot of people that are hiding in the workplace. There are a lot of people that are pushing back and creating an immune response. Goldman Sachs has done an analysis and found that actually there's something kind of interesting. 7% of GDP can be increased through the AI movement, just through productivity. That is $7 trillion over a 10-year period. That is a fundamental step change in how we work. And they believe that is coming. So there's something else that happens to a business because we're dealing with old businesses. We're dealing with businesses that have been around for a long time that are trying to tap into this. And one of the things they're trying to figure out is, who are they? So I have this favorite example of this idea that a company basically has this, I'm a beer company. Hang on, but you sell Coca-Cola. Oh, I'm a thirst company. And these realizations are insane. I was at a function recently. Shell offered this entire sort of 300 people at their energy campus in Amsterdam, and it was a lot of fun, but The topic was, how do I move from a product company to a service company? How do I take advantage of ecosystems? You know, how do I do things faster? How do I create innovation in my business? All of these are challenges that are happening in every business today, and they're struggling. And they're struggling because when we got down to it, great, we found this really innovative thing that we want to do. It would take 6 months of analysis and 6 months of requirements gathering before we could figure out even how to get going. And why? All these busy people, all these diaries, and the serious lack of productivity. So there is an identity crisis issue, but there's also a massive productivity issue.
And when you think about the identity crisis, it's a real opportunity to rethink your business, correct? So if I take the history of Microsoft that I grew up in for so long, clearly it was a PC on every desktop was Bill Gates' vision, right? And so once he accomplished that, and Satya came into office, he had to rethink what were we going to really think about an organizational transformation? How did we recreate our mission and rethink who we were going to be as a company? And everyone it drove a cultural change across the organization for everybody to get behind, to really think about empowering every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. Even despite the fact that I've been gone a year, I can still quote that verbatim because the entire organization got behind that mission. Everything that we did, every meeting that we did, everything that we were presenting as an organization, who our identity was grounded in that mission. And generative AI offers an opportunity for us to really make sure that we have clarity on what is our mission as an organization, what are we looking to deliver as an organization, and how do we drive our culture and our change management toward that outcome that we're looking to achieve. I think we all remember the Westeros battle, yes, where the living got together to battle the Battle of the Dawn, I think it was called, where the living came together to fight the White Walkers. So it was the one time in the entire series where they actually weren't trying to fight each other, right? They came together to figure out what was that common outcome, what was that common enemy that they were going to get behind. And so think about your organization today and this two worlds problem that you have. The priorities and the goals across your entire organization are different. So how can you leverage generative AI to have the common outcome that your organization is looking to drive forward that you can focus on?
And if you think about this divide that exists between IT and business, that is one of the biggest battlegrounds that exists. I've heard some fascinating things, like an investment banking president turned around to me one day and said, "Are you going to try sell me 18 months of hope and I'm going to use Excel anyway?" And he's right. That is this giant chasm that exists and these unmet needs. If you go read a Jeffrey Moore book from 1991, the use cases are no different to the ones that we see today. And actually what's super fascinating was I was at this function, and there's a member of the crowd here who's at that function, and these folks said something kind of interesting. They were talking about the pandemic, and they were talking about sharing data and working to a common goal. And the fact that every single person on the planet wanted to get out of their house, that was a common goal, and we united around that challenge, and we did some prolifically incredible things through that. So that in itself, we've all lived that experience. That demonstrates with a common goal and that coming together and that kind of getting out of our own way, we as humans are adaptive. We're very good at this sort of thing, but we're always going to be divided if it's me versus we.
The other thing I think that we're seeing generative really unlock that organizations are asking us about is how do we think about talent and enablement? And so how do you really think about the talent pipeline that we're looking to grow, and how do you think about unlocking the talent pipeline that may not exist today? Because right, when human language, I love that, that was on my panel earlier, by the way, human language unlocks sort of the power of technology. You now have a bunch of humans that have never been in technology that you can unlock as your talent pipeline. So when you think about how hard it is for you to find new talent and for your data teams and your data organization, how are you thinking about the untapped talent that can create the net new pipeline?
And if you think about the open source thing, there's a reason why Databricks philosophically believes in donating to open source and fostering and growing communities to create these open standards. And we see it in our legacy. we see our legacy systems having tech and skills that don't actually, they're not around anymore. Or they're, playing golf and they're, very, very old. But the reality is that open source prevails. One could argue that this whole English being the sort of programming language or any, language itself, that is the ultimate form of open source, because actually, none of us debate, well, yeah, maybe we debate words and dictionaries and thesauruses, but we're accepting and that is something quite ancient and prolific. So using that as a common format, as a common language to interface, removes that divide in a material way. So that's why we're kind of pushing up to bring the entire enterprise to the Lakehouse.
But it also opens up diversity across your teams, right? If you think about what a struggle sometimes it is to get differing points of view, and now is the time more than ever where you need, if you're really thinking about ethics and identifying bias and being transparent and how you're going to deliver it against the organization, this is the best time for you to think about how do you now bring diversity into your organization and leverage Gen AI as the mechanism to get them into place.
And the thing you could do to get started today in this strategy, in this kind of adoption, is get everybody prompting. Everybody needs to learn how to prompt, how to put in the right sort of keywords to get the outcomes they want. That is a really low bar, and it's a low barrier. And we use it at home, we use it, I was listening to one of our product team who basically created, it was a super clever idea, basically created some crazy thing in history to the theme of Hamilton that was they read out every night at dinner. And every one of them had a go of like prompting this thing. And it was crazy interesting, but what it's doing is building that muscle internally. It's building that muscle in every single person, because we need to learn how to speak to data in a way that nobody has before.
And don't limit it to just your data teams. Some of the biggest organizations that we work with globally are thinking about how do we do things like data days? How do we enable everyone across the business to learn how to prompt, to learn how to start to build this skill and capability? Because as their jobs shift and change, that's what's going to keep them able to continue to deliver value. They have that business knowledge inside their heads. You don't want to lose them from outside the business. So let's think about leveraging this as a point in time where we can bring them along on the journey. And that requires some level of change management, right? That's often the hardest part. How do you think about really building out something like ProSci and have that awareness and bring them along on that change management journey to make sure that you're continuing to capture the existing talent across the organization, not just in your data teams?
So we had this little moment where this year that kicked off this whole sort of campaign of Game of Thrones and this sort of parallel that we're seeing in the world. And it was something like Robin and I used to talk quite a lot, like just about our experiences and some of the customers we were talking to and some of the things we observed in the room where there was literal dissent right in front of you and just groups that just were not on the same page at all. And I had the benefit of sitting on an airplane, and some of you heard me speak about this the other day, but this is actually what sort of sparked the movement is I was sitting next to a guy on a plane on my way to Qatar, and I had this slide open that just basically said Game of Thrones, and I was nowhere with it. I was kind of trying to develop a point of view. We had a bunch of teams that were trying to work with customers that had this factional breakdown, and nobody could agree on what the direction was. Clearly, the strategy was missing. And he started laughing. And I sort of turned around, asked him, and he said, well, I said, what do you do? He went, I'm an organizational psychologist. So we sat down for 8 hours on this plane talking.
Only Dael could have an 8-hour conversation with
seriously, and it was one of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had on an airplane. And not to say that's something I do commonly, but truly one of those awesome moments. What he told me, and we walked around it, I went, what is your method? The thing he told me, which was firstly quite interesting, is he was a CIO. He wanted to make change 25 years ago, couldn't, and went into organizational design. Realized that wasn't going to move the needle, went into culture change. Realized that wasn't going to move the needle because he had identified something really interesting. And that was that it's around behavior, and moving down through the organization, he now does group therapy, which is kind of funny, and it's why we like to tease out this, CTO equals therapy thing. But it is true that organizations have a whole bunch of symptoms. And I asked him, what are the symptoms you see when you do a diagnostic, when you go in and you actually try to assess? And he says, you watch how decisions are made. Now, what's super fascinating that is how decisions are made, and when he called it decision theater, and actually we have something that all of us can kind of lean on called decision science. And actually there's a very cool analogy that starts to play out where you can start to play games internally to figure out how are we making decisions? Are we a consensus culture? Do things move across before they do anything? Are we a risk culture? Things go up and down all the time. Look at an org chart and imagine just how slow decision making can happen if you have to keep going up and down all the time. And trust me, I've been in the C-suite, they're shooting from the hip. They don't have the evidence. It's experience bias that they're going with. So this is an opportunity to use data to help us to solve a lot of these problems.
And having lived this at Microsoft, I think they're probably the most infamous company of having infighting between organizations, right? Which is why you see multiple products deliver the sort of the same capabilities. That's legacy from the organization being in exactly this type of position. And the problem is it's not culture. Everybody talks about data culture all the time, but you're really trying to drive behavioral change across your organization. How do you really think about understanding all of the landscape across your organization? What are the pitfalls? Where are you going to create not just slogans and mottos and try to get the organization to all chant the same thing at your company kickoff every year? How do you actually start to drive, through programmatic investments, how do you start to drive this mental model that organizations need to go through to ground them around these behavioral change that they need to drive?
This whole idea of individuals versus leadership, the whole idea of me versus we, you can see that play out in all organizations. So one could say, how do we use the data breadcrumbs that we're gathering and start to use generative AI to kind of solve some of these things? And that is a really safe space to play around and to actually start to figure out decision science. Because at the end of the day, your business leaders, they just want to go, look, tell me A, B, or C. Just give me the information so I can make a choice. All right, so let's segue into trade and exchange. Okay, why did we bring that up in the first place? So trade and exchange.
Clicker error, sorry, user error.
Clicker. So trade and exchange, you saw our marketplace. So start to think about what marketplaces and clean rooms and data exchange can look like in your organization as we go through and show you some of the thinking around this.
So in the conversations that we're having, these are what we'll share with you are some real world examples of where organizations are thinking about using Gen AI as first use cases or early use cases within their organization. So the first most obvious is sort of this data sharing. How are we going to share data within our organization and how do we share it outside of our organization? So a lot around the marketplace. How do you think about not just data assets, but models, et cetera, and being able to actually share those things outside of the organization? How do you monetize against that? So I probably had like 16 conversations this week about how do we create a new business model around Gen AI that's going to help us create net new revenue for the organization to justify the investment that we need to make to be able to deliver against Gen AI. And then how do you build ecosystems around that across your organization? So organizations are really starting to think about it's not just a me, but it's a we that helps us deliver against this.
And sorry.
Nope.
6 minutes, we've got to move fast. Okay, so another way of thinking about this is the ecosystems that sit between verticals are super, super interesting. But the internal, divisions are very interesting too. Think finance and marketing. How many debates about revenue can you possibly have before you go crazy? This is an opportunity for each of them to trade and exchange and actually figure that out together. Figure out what is the currency that allows you to solve that problem. Think about business systems. Think about all the resilient supply chains. There's a huge host of things that you can solve by using data and using generative AI and using machine learning and other forms of AI. Think about fraud. Think about money laundering. I have 2 banks in Sweden that are thinking about joint venturing because they know that the fraudsters are dividing them, and actually there's a very interesting thing if they collaborate to solve this problem. Think about this knowledge sharing that we mentioned earlier. So we're moving a little faster, just by the way. And think about like how knowledge can be captured in your business. Think about all those file servers and systems. Now, what's super fascinating is this was what was said by, actually I met, Nicola, the EY CTO, a couple of weeks ago. And this is something that every company are thinking about. How do I tap into the organizational knowledge? Where is the organizational knowledge? How do I organize this? And if you look at ChatGPT and the corpus of the internet that it trained on, that was a prompt I made, and look at the answer. It's a pretty decent answer.
But most organizations are focused on these knowledge management as the first use case that they're trying to tackle. We call them the quiet AI or boring or however you want to title it. But it's things like HR policy and exposing that to employee. It's about internal documentation. At Databricks, that was the first use case that we did internally, was trying to collect all of the Confluence pages that we had around, and could we make it easily searchable for all employees to be able to access it, because just the proliferation of data.
Ancient code. This is a step change that you can make. There is so much knowledge sitting inside your old code bases, inside your legacy systems. Don't convert them to modern code without analyzing them first. You have an opportunity to convert it to natural language and really go through it in a material way. Think bronze, silver, gold. The bronze is you just building a kind of capability to extract from those ancient systems. Think silver. I could start to pull it apart. I could start to figure out quality code. I could start to figure out duplication. I've got a whole list of business rules. I can push that to the business and start to prompt validate requirements before I figure out where to go with it. There are huge opportunities that you have to hoover up institutional knowledge. Joking aside, somebody actually called this like code archaeology, but like it might sound funny, but you have so much. The older the business, the older the system, there is so much heritage there. And these systems, you can't remove them because you don't know what they do. So let's get into this industrial process and revolution. Like this whole thing, this background that we're all trying to deal with, this legacy, the ultimate legacy, which is this 200-year-old operating system that dates back to Napoleon. You've got to start to think about the fact that between Toyota, Six Sigma, the next step change is AI. There's this kind of joke internally that we have called AI middle management, okay? I don't even know what that looks like, but don't you want to be part of figuring that out? That's experiments that you could really work out. Like, what are decisions that can be made on the edges of the business that are safe? There's a watermark. There's a safe place where it doesn't have to move all the way up the hierarchy and all the way down. Are there new organizational structures? There's legitimately a company that is tracking the number of new emerging, less than 6-month-old, 5-people companies that are earning $1 million in revenue. That's very interesting, right?
And then having an operations background, I think business process is the other quick win that we can think about for organizations. At Microsoft, one of the very first things that they tackled internally was the finance platform to be able to report out to the market, because there were Excel spreadsheets everywhere with thousands of finance resources leveraging them. And so use that as an opportunity to really rethink how can you take an internal business process and convert that leveraging Gen AI for the next sort of level of capability.
I think the ultimate is bureaucracy and admin. Think about what you could do with those.
And then, of course, it wouldn't be a session either if we didn't close out with governance. I think the importance of trust as you think about leveraging generative AI across your organization is becoming more and more prevalent. We're still waiting for legislation to be decided on what's going to happen here. Organizations are not going to trust anything that you try to implement with Gen AI to change their behaviors, to change their processes, et cetera, unless they have clarity on sort of what it's doing, what's the full transparency of it, is it accurate, is it complete, are you delivering timeliness, and so how do you make sure that you're building the trust as you implement these new ecosystems around process and change. And we all know that what happens when you don't have trust and transparency, that it doesn't fare well at the very end and everybody dies by a dragon.
Just to sum up, there's opportunities in the ecosystems. Those spaces between your line of business units, those spaces between the different verticals. Think about things like freight forwarding. Think about things that just fundamentally are driven through email, through Excel spreadsheets, and the exchange of crazy formats of data. Think about knowledge. You can totally unlock the institutional knowledge of your business. You can open that up and surface it and do some incredibly important things. Productivity, this is the game changer. Let's reinvent how we work. Let's actually find some ways of using AI to kind of unlock that ancient legacy that we still have to deal with today. And governance, this is an area that we're hoping to take all the painful pieces away so that when you walk over to that person who you want to be, owner of this data, they don't have to take accountability of this horrible data quality, this horrible master data management, all the other things that they just literally do not need on top of their day job. And just to close, with Databricks, your data, your models, and you've seen a whole lot of things on how these can be your models, and this is something we'd love you to really drift into, and your property. This is your IP. This is safe spaces to work. This is stuff you can use to build that capability internally and actually help yourselves to answer your CEO's question, what is my strategy today? So you've got to ask yourself, how will AI help you with this revolution? And with that, we thank you for your time today.
All right. Thank you, Dael and Rob.